The knock didn't sound like a neighbor asking for sugar. It was firm, practiced, the kind that says, "I'm here on business." When I opened the door, two strangers in suits stood on my porch, clipboards in hand. "Mr. Harper?" the taller one asked. "Yes?" "We're here to measure the property. Congratulations on the sale." "Sale?" I looked past them, and that's when I saw it. A bright red sold sign staked into my front lawn, leaning slightly in the afternoon breeze. My name is Daniel Harper, and what you're about to hear is the story of how my own children sold the house I built with my bare hands, and how I made sure they'd never forget who really owned it. Sit back and let me tell you how I went from blindsided to holding the winning hand. Before we get too far, don't forget to subscribe and let me know where you're listening from. I stepped out onto the porch, still staring at that sign like it had been dropped from another planet. "This must be a mistake," I said, though my voice didn't sound convincing even to me. The shorter man flipped a page on his clipboard. Address matches. "Closing date set for next Friday." "Closing date, Friday. 4 days from now." The man nodded politely, heading toward their car. My legs carried me down the walkway after them before my mind caught up. Who authorized this? They exchanged a look, the way people do when they know something you don't. Your children said they had power of attorney. Power of attorney. The words hit harder than the sold sign. I went back inside, each step heavier than the last. The house felt different now. Not the safe, worn place I'd spent the last 42 years. It felt like a stranger was already moving in, rearranging my life in their head. Framed photographs lined the hallway, my late wife's smile, our kids as toddlers in mismatched pajamas, the oak tree in the backyard we planted the summer we moved in. I touched the edge of one frame, my fingers tracing the glass. The phone sat on the kitchen counter. I didn't remember picking it up, just hearing the dial tone in my ear. I called Emily first, my eldest. She answered on the second ring. "Dad, I was just about to call you." "Then let me save you the trouble. Why is there a sold sign in my yard?" A pause. Too long. "Oh, you saw that." "Yes, I saw that. Care to explain?" Her voice softened. That rehearsed, "This is for your own good," tone I'd heard before. "Dad, you're 73. This place is too much for you. The stairs, the yard, you need somewhere easier." "Easier?" My grip tightened on the phone. "I've managed just fine." "It's already done, Dad. The buyer's thrilled. You'll love the new condo we found." I didn't hear the rest. I was looking out the kitchen window at the oak tree, its branches moving gently in the wind. That tree's roots went deeper than my kids' understanding of what this house meant. I hung up without saying goodbye. The kitchen felt too quiet, the tick of the wall clock suddenly louder than usual. I pulled out a chair at the table and sat down, the way I used to after long shifts at the mill, letting the silence settle before deciding my next move. I could still smell the faint aroma of coffee from that morning, now gone cold in the pot. A good house holds on to things, scents, echoes, the warmth of a family meal, even when people forget. This house had been holding for decades. I dialed my youngest, Brian. No greeting, just, "Dad, before you say anything, it was Emily's idea." "That makes it better." He sighed. "We just want you safe. The condo's got an elevator, 24-hour security, everything you need." "What I need," I said, "is to live in my home." Brian's voice hardened. "You'll thank us later. Paperwork's already signed." The line went dead before I could reply. That was the thing about my kids. They didn't ask. They decided. Maybe they thought my age meant my vote didn't count anymore. Maybe they forgot that every nail in these walls was paid for by my hands. The next morning I took my coffee out to the porch. The sold sign was still there, the red letters catching the early sun like a warning. A jogger passing by slowed down. "Congrats on the sale, Mr. Harper," he called. I forced a polite nod. Word travels fast in small towns. Faster than the truth. The mailman arrived, handing me a thin envelope. Inside, the "Welcome to your new home" brochure for the condo. They'd even included a map with directions. I stared at the glossy photos, sterile hallways, beige carpeting, a balcony overlooking a parking lot, and felt something settle deep in my chest. It wasn't sadness, not exactly. It was the quiet resolve that comes before a storm. If my kids thought this was over, they were about to learn how wrong they were. And if you think you know where this is headed, you're not even close. I didn't go into town that day. Didn't want the whispers, the sympathetic smiles, the pats on the back that really meant glad it's you, not me. Instead, I walked the perimeter of my property. The grass was long near the back fence where the mower blade had dulled, and the shed door needed paint. Imperfect, yes, but it was mine. Inside the shed, the smell of cut wood and machine oil brought back winters, spent fixing furniture, mending tools, finding purpose after my wife passed. On the workbench sat the old ledger I kept for repairs. Not just costs, but stories. December 1998. Fixed the rocking chair where Emily nursed her first baby. May 2007. Rebuilt the back steps after Brian broke them moving his drums in. Every page was a reminder. This house wasn't just lumber and nails. It was a living record. By noon, I knew I couldn't just sit and wait for the movers. I needed to know exactly how they'd managed this. The legal part of me, the part my kids underestimated, wanted to see the paperwork. I called an old friend, Mark Sullivan. We had worked side by side at the mill before he went into real estate law. "Danny," he said after I explained, "if they've got power of attorney, they can sell without your signature. But it's not the end. Then, where's the start? Come by my office tomorrow. Bring any mail, contracts, or notices you've got. And Danny, don't sign a thing." That night, the house felt heavier. I made a simple dinner, eggs and toast, and ate at the kitchen table, staring at the dim outline of the sold sign through the window. A couple of cars slowed as they passed, their headlights brushing across my walls like searchlights. Curiosity is a powerful thing in a small town. After washing the dishes, I wandered into the living room and lowered myself into my old recliner. The leather was cracked, molded to my shape after years of use. On the wall opposite, the mantel still held my wife's porcelain figurines, a dozen little ballerinas in frozen poses. I remembered how she used to dust them every Saturday morning, humming under her breath. Losing the house wasn't just losing walls and a roof. It was losing her all over again. The next morning, I was at Mark's office before the blinds were up. He poured coffee into mismatched mugs and motioned for me to sit. "Let's see what we've got." I handed over the envelope from the mail, the condo brochure, and a few legal-looking letters I hadn't opened. Mark read silently, occasionally shaking his head. "They used a durable power of attorney you signed in 2016, he said finally. "That was for emergencies," I protested. "Exactly. And here's the thing. Selling your primary residence without consulting, you could be contested, especially if it's not in your best interest." He leaned back, tapping the papers. "If the buyer hasn't recorded the deed yet, there's room to maneuver." Room to maneuver. That was all I needed. On my way home, I drove past the county recorder's office. Out front, a row of pickup trucks lined the curb, contractors waiting for permits. It hit me then. Someone had plans for my house. Big plans. And plans can be disrupted. When I pulled into my driveway, a silver SUV was parked at the curb. Emily climbed out, holding a to-go coffee. "Dad, we need to talk." She followed me inside, looking around like she was already saying goodbye to the place. "Brian and I thought it would be best to clear things up. The condo's ready next week. We've arranged movers." "I'm not going." Her smile faltered. "Dad, don't make this harder." "I'm not making it anything. You are." We sat at the kitchen table, the same place I'd helped her with algebra, talked her through breakups, handed her car keys when she got her license. Now she was handing me an eviction wrapped in concern. "I know you think this is about control," she said, "but it's about safety. You've fallen twice this year." "Once," I corrected. and the second time was a sprained ankle from the latter. Her tone shifted. This isn't up for debate. The buyer's set. The deposit's paid. I studied her face. The mix of determination and unease. She believed what she was doing was right. Or she wanted to believe it badly enough to ignore me. When she left, the air felt colder. I stood at the front window, watching her drive away, and thought about what Mark had said. If the deed wasn't recorded yet, I had time. Not much, but enough. The rest of the afternoon, I dug through my file cabinet. Tax records, old repair receipts, insurance policies. I found the original deed, yellowed at the edges, and tucked it into a folder. It wasn't proof of current ownership, but it was a reminder to myself. This was mine. That evening, I called Mark again. "I want to know who the buyer is," I said. "You sure?" "Yes, and I want to meet them." There was a pause. "I can find out. But Danny, be careful. This could get messy." "Messy's fine," I said. "Messy means I'm still in the fight." 2 days later, Mark called back. "You're not going to like this. The buyer's a developer, planning to tear the place down and split the lot." The words sank like stones. Tear it down. Not renovate, not live in, erase. I hung up and walked outside, past the sold sign, to the oak tree. I pressed my palm against its bark, rough and solid beneath my hand. They'd have to cut it down, too. And that was the moment I knew I wasn't just going to stop the sale. I was going to make sure whoever thought they could erase me would regret even trying. The next morning, I skipped coffee at home and headed straight into town. If the buyer was a developer, there'd be records, permits filed, meetings scheduled, maybe even public notices. The county clerk's office sat between the library and the post office, an old brick building with squeaky doors and a smell of paper that had been sitting for decades. Mrs. Latham was behind the counter, the same as she'd been for as long as I could remember. "Danny Harper," she said, peering over her glasses. "Haven't seen you in a while." "Trying to keep a low profile," I replied. "Listen, I need to look up a property file." She slid the request form toward me without asking which one. News travels fast here. When I wrote down my address, her eyebrows rose. "Word is you sold to Caldwell Development. Big project planned." "That's what I heard," I said. "I want to see what they've got on record." She disappeared into the back and returned with a thin folder. Inside were a purchase agreement, preliminary blueprints, and a demolition request stamped pending. The blueprints showed my house replaced by 2 oversized modern builds, driveways where my wife's roses grew, no sign of the oak tree. "Can I get a copy of this?" Mrs. Latham hesitated. "Not supposed to hand these out before they're finalized." I looked her in the eye. "Mary, you've known me 40 years. This is my home we're talking about." She glanced at the clock, then slipped the pages into a manila envelope. "Don't tell anyone where you got them." Back in my truck, I spread the plans on the passenger seat. Every line was cold, impersonal, measured in square footage, not in memories. That's when the idea began to form. If Caldwell Development wanted my land so badly, maybe I could give them a reason to back away. Not by fighting head-on, that's what they'd expect, but by making it the worst deal they'd ever made. That afternoon, I called Antonio. We'd been friends since before he opened the hardware store. When he picked up, I said, "You still have that contact in historical preservation?" He laughed. "You're finally going to register the house?" "Something like that. Can you get me the paperwork?" If the property got flagged as historically significant because of its age, its architecture, even the oak tree, it could delay demolition for months, maybe years. Developers hate delays. While I waited for Antonio to call back, I went through boxes in the attic. Old photographs of the house under construction, me and my wife in our 20s, grinning through dust and sweat. A letter from the original builder, dated 1929, congratulating the first owner. An article from the local paper in 1954 about the oak tree, planted to honor veterans returning from the war. I spread them out on the dining room table like evidence in a case. Because that's what this was. Not just a sale, but a trial to decide whether my life's work got to exist. Emily stopped by unannounced that evening. She walked in without knocking, as if the house were already hers. "I saw your truck at the clerk's office," she said, dropping her purse on the counter. "You keeping tabs on me now?" "I just want this to go smoothly, Dad. Please don't start something that's only going to make it harder." I gestured to the table. "Look at this. The house is nearly 100 years old. That oak tree is older than both of us combined." She glanced at the papers, then shook her head. "It's still just a house. You could make new memories somewhere else." I stared at her, wondering how anyone could be raised here and still think that way. "It's not the walls, Emily. It's what happened inside them." Her eyes softened for a moment, but only for a moment. "You'll be happier once you've moved. You just can't see it yet." She picked up her purse. "Brian's coming by tomorrow. Maybe you'll listen to him." I watched her drive away, my jaw tight. They weren't just trying to move me. They were trying to convince themselves it was for my benefit. That was almost worse. Antonio called the next morning. "Got the forms," he said. "Historical review's slow, but once it's filed, they can't touch the property until it's processed." "How slow?" "Months if you're lucky." That was enough. Delay buys time, and time changes the game. I spent the day gathering everything that might support the application. Photographs, documents, even the handwritten notes my wife kept about the garden over the years. By evening, the dining room table was a mosaic of our life here. Just before sunset, Brian pulled into the driveway. He didn't come to the door right away, stood by his car, staring at the sold sign like it was a trophy. When he finally knocked, I let him in without a word. "Dad," he began, "this fight isn't worth it. You'll lose, and you'll just make yourself miserable in the process. I've been miserable since the day you decided this without me. It's done. The buyers are good people." "They're developers," I corrected. "They want to tear this place down." Brian shrugged. "That's progress." Something in me went cold at that word. Progress. The same word they used when they bulldozed the old mill, when they paved over the park for a strip mall. Progress for someone else's benefit. I walked him to the door without saying more. Out on the porch, the oak tree cast long shadows across the yard. It had stood through storms, droughts, and winters so cold the air froze in your lungs. It would stand through this, too, if I had anything to say about it. If you think my kids were the only ones with a plan, you're about to find out how wrong that is. 2 days later, I walked into the County Historical Society with my folder. The receptionist was a young woman with a neat bun and the kind of patient smile you only get from dealing with stubborn locals. "I'd like to submit a historical review request for my property," I said, sliding the paperwork across the counter. She flipped through the pages, her eyes pausing on the black and white photo of the oak tree with a group of veterans in front. "This is strong," she said. "The tree alone might qualify for protection. The fact that the house has retained its original architecture helps too." I left with a stamped copy of the application and a small but important comfort. From this moment, Caldwell Development couldn't legally demolish a thing until the review was complete. That evening, my phone rang. It was Emily, her voice tight. "Dad, what did you do?" "I filed for historical review." She groaned audibly. "Do you realize what a mess this makes? The buyers are furious. They're threatening to pull out." "Good," I said simply. Silence. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, almost cautious. "You're going to lose, Dad. They have lawyers." "So do I." The next morning, a black SUV I didn't recognize parked across the street. 2 men in tailored suits got out and began taking photos of the house, the yard, the oak tree. I stood on the porch, coffee in hand, not moving. If they wanted me to feel intimidated, they'd picked the wrong man. At noon, Brian showed up unannounced, as usual. "Dad, this is getting out of hand." Caldwell called me directly. They said, "You're sabotaging the deal." "I'm protecting my home." "This isn't just about you," he snapped. "Emily and I need our share of the proceeds." And there it was. The part they hadn't said out loud until now. The money. not safety, not concern. Cash. How much did they promise you? I asked. Brian didn't answer, but his silence was enough. That night, I called Mark. Is there a way to see the purchase contract? Already ahead of you, he said. There's a clause. If demolition is delayed more than 90 days, the buyer can walk away without penalty. And get this, the deposit is non-refundable. Which meant, if Caldwell pulled out, I'd keep the deposit and the house. The next day, I started making calls of my own. A local reporter owed me a favor from years back when I helped her father repair his roof after a storm. When I told her about the oak tree's history and the demolition plans, she agreed it would make a good human interest piece. By Friday, a photographer was in my yard, snapping shots of me standing beside the oak, my hand resting on its trunk. The story ran in the Sunday paper, Veterans Memorial Oak at Risk in Harper sale dispute. Monday morning, my phone didn't stop ringing. Neighbors, old friends, even strangers offering support. But the best call came from Mark. Caldwell just filed a request to back out of the purchase, he said, barely hiding his grin. They're citing unexpected community resistance. The deposit's yours. I hung up and sat at the kitchen table, staring out at the yard. The sold sign was still there, but it looked different now. Not a victory for them, but a marker of the battle I'd just won. Of course, I knew my kids wouldn't see it that way. And when Emily's car pulled into the driveway that afternoon, I could already picture the storm about to walk through my door. She came in fast, eyes blazing. You blew up the sale. Do you have any idea what you've cost us? What I've saved is more important. You're unbelievable, she said, her voice shaking. All we wanted was to make things easier for you. No, I said quietly, you wanted to make things easier for yourselves. She didn't reply, just grabbed her purse and left. I watched from the porch as she drove off, the oak tree's shadow stretching long across the lawn. If they thought this was the end of it, they were about to learn the real fight hadn't even started yet. The next morning, I woke to the sound of a car idling outside my window. When I pulled back the curtain, there it was, Emily's SUV, parked half on the curb. She wasn't alone. Brian stood beside her, both of them looking toward the house with the posture of people about to quote to quote a verdict. That was really a verdict. I opened the door before they could knock. Morning, I said evenly. Emily's arms were crossed. Brian's jaw was tight. We've talked, Emily began, and we think you're making a mistake. I didn't move. You've made that clear. Brian stepped forward. We've found another buyer, different developer. They're willing to pay more, and they'll wait out your little historical review stunt. Stunt? I repeated. That oak tree is older than you, Brian. It's a memorial. It's just a tree, he shot back. I almost laughed. That was the difference between us. To them, the past was clutter. To me, it was the foundation of everything. Here's the thing, Dad, Emily said, her voice going from firm to rehearsed. If you cooperate this time, we can make sure you're comfortable. If you fight again, we can challenge your capacity in court. There it was. The escalation I knew was coming. They weren't just pushing me out of the house anymore. They were threatening my independence. After they left, I called Mark. They're talking about capacity hearings now, I said. He didn't sound surprised. If they try that, they'll need evidence. Keep everything in writing from here on out. Every conversation, every threat, every offer, document it. That afternoon, I dug out an old spiral notebook and started writing. Dates, times, what was said, who was present. If they wanted a fight on paper, I'd give them a library. A week later, I got a letter in the mail. Inside was an official notice from the new buyer's lawyer. They intended to proceed with a sale once the historical review concluded, regardless of sentimental attachments. The phrasing made my teeth clench. Sentimental attachments. As if the sum of a life could be dismissed with 2 words. That evening I went back to the attic, looking for anything that could extend the review process. I found more: blueprints from 1929, original woodwork receipts, even a brittle newspaper clipping showing my street when it was just dirt and a handful of houses. If Caldwell had thought the first delay was bad, this new buyer was about to learn what slow really looked like. Antonio came by the next morning with a box of supplies. "You're going to make a case. Make it airtight," he said. We spent the day photographing every original feature of the house: the crown molding, the fireplace tile my wife chose, the oak banister worn smooth from decades of hands sliding along it. Each click of the camera felt like reclaiming ground they'd tried to take. By the end of the week, the new buyer sent their own inspector. He walked through with a clipboard, making notes, barely looking at me. When he paused by the fireplace, I said casually, "Tiles original, shipped from Italy in 32. They don't make it like that anymore." He wrote something down without answering, but I caught the flicker of recognition, another delay seed planted. That night, I got a text from Emily. "Why are you making this harder? We just want to move on." I stared at the words before replying. Some things aren't meant to be moved on from. In the quiet after, I realized the real battle wasn't about a house. It was about control, about whether I got to decide when my story here ended. And I wasn't done telling it yet. 3 mornings later, I found a notice taped to my front door. Property access required, site survey scheduled. In small print at the bottom, refusal to grant access may result in legal action. I peeled it off and set it on the kitchen table. The gall of it, they were treating me like some stubborn tenant, not the man who'd kept this roof upright for over 40 years. By noon, I could hear footsteps outside. When I opened the door, 2 surveyors were pacing the yard with measuring wheels. "This is private property," I said. One of them barely looked up. "We have authorization from the buyer." "Funny," I replied. The owner didn't give it. They hesitated, unsure. I pulled out my phone. "You can either leave now or explain to the sheriff why you're trespassing." That did it. They mumbled something about rescheduling and made for the truck. That afternoon, I called the local paper again. The reporter from before was more than willing to write a follow-up. This time, the headline read, "Developers push into disputed historic property despite ongoing review." The story got shared all over the county Facebook groups. By evening, my voicemail was full, neighbors offering to sign petitions, an old high school friend volunteering to rally the Veterans Association to protect the oak tree. 2 days later, Emily showed up again, her expression brittle. "You've turned this into a circus," she said before she was even through the door. "I've turned it into a community conversation," I corrected. She dropped into a chair, exhaling hard. "Brian says the buyer's threatening to sue us personally if the sale falls through. Then maybe you should stop trying to sell what's not yours to sell." Her eyes narrowed. "You think you're winning, but all you're doing is burning bridges." I leaned on the back of a chair, meeting her gaze. "Some bridges are worth burning if they lead somewhere you shouldn't go." She didn't answer that. Instead, she left in a hurry, slamming the door harder than necessary. That night, I took a slow walk around the property. The moonlight silvered the edges of the oak leaves, the air cool with the smell of damp earth. In the stillness, I could almost hear my wife's voice, the way she used to say this house felt alive, like it breathed with us. I stopped at the far corner of the yard where the fence post leaned slightly inward. The developer's plans showed a driveway here, cutting through what had always been my vegetable garden. It wasn't just about the house. They wanted to erase everything I'd touched. The next morning, Mark called with an update. The new buyer's legal team filed a motion to expedite the historical review, trying to force a decision before the 90-day clock runs out. I could hear the satisfaction in his voice as he added, "But the county board doesn't take kindly to being pushed. They're scheduling a public hearing instead." A hearing meant people could speak. And I already knew exactly who I wanted to fill that room. Over the next week, I visited neighbors, veterans, old friends from the mill. I brought photos, the newspaper clippings, even my wife's garden notes. Every person I spoke to promised to show up and tell the board why the house, and especially the oak tree, mattered. Antonio offered to cater the hearing. "Free sandwiches get people talking," he said with a grin. When the day came, the meeting room was standing room only. Developers in pressed suits sat on one side, the rest of the seats filled with familiar faces. People who'd known me for decades. The board chair opened the floor for comments. One by one, neighbors spoke. A woman recalled her wedding photos under the oak tree. An elderly veteran talked about the day it was planted. A teacher mentioned the history lessons she gave her students about our street. By the time I stood, the air in the room had shifted. "This isn't just my house," I said. "It's a chapter in this town's story. You can't tear down history without tearing out part of who we are." The board didn't decide that day. They said they'd review all submissions. But I could see it in the developers' eyes as they walked out. They hadn't expected a fight like this. That evening, as I locked the front door, my phone buzzed with a new text from an unknown number. "Enjoy your little victory. It won't last." I stared at the screen, a slow smile forming. If they thought I was finished, they had no idea what was coming. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. No surveyors, no letters, no unannounced visits from Emily or Brian. But I've been around long enough to know. Quiet is just the space before a storm. On Thursday morning, I got my confirmation. Mark called, his voice tight. "They filed a petition in probate court, Danny. They're claiming you're no longer competent to manage your own affairs." I sat down hard at the kitchen table. That's their play now? Looks like it. If the court agrees, they can take control of everything, not just the house. The thought of them going through my bank accounts, my personal papers, deciding what I could and couldn't do. I gripped the edge of the table until my knuckles whitened. "They're saying you've been erratic," Mark went on. "That you're hoarding, neglecting maintenance, isolating yourself. They've even got statements from a couple of neighbors." I felt a cold twist in my gut. Not all neighbors are friends, and money can turn even friendly ones into liars. That afternoon, I went straight to Antonio's hardware store. He listened without interrupting, his hands resting heavy on the counter. "They think they can win by making you look weak," he said finally. "So show them you're stronger than ever." The next morning, I booked an appointment with my doctor. Full physical, cognitive test, the works. When I walked out with a clean bill of health and paperwork to prove it, I felt lighter. Evidence is a hard thing to argue with. I also started inviting people over, one or two at a time. A retired teacher from down the street, a family friend who'd known me since I was 20. We'd sit on the porch, drink coffee, talk where anyone could see. If they were going to claim I was isolated, I'd make it impossible to believe. Still, I knew they wouldn't stop there. On Monday, a letter arrived from the buyer's lawyer. It wasn't just about the house anymore. They were demanding I vacate the property voluntarily to avoid further legal entanglements. I set the letter on the counter, poured myself a coffee, and read it again slowly. The wording was deliberate, polite enough for a judge, sharp enough to intimidate. That night, Emily called. "I don't want it to come to this, Dad. Just let it go." "Let it go?" I said quietly. "You mean let me go?" She didn't answer. I could hear her breathing, the hesitation in it. "Think about what you're doing," I said before ending the call. The hearing for the historical review was rescheduled for the following week. The developer's reps showed up early, flanked by two suited lawyers. They spoke about progress and economic growth and revitalization, their words polished to a shine. When it was my turn, I didn't bother with polish. "This isn't about progress," I told the board. "It's about erasure, and if you erase this place, you erase part of the people who built it." After the meeting, a man I didn't know shook my hand outside. "Saw your story in the paper. My grandfather planted a similar oak in our town. They tried to cut it down. We stopped them." "Good to know it's possible," I said. The next day, as I walked out to get the mail, I saw it A fresh stake in the ground by the curb, bright orange ribbon fluttering in the wind. A survey marker. They weren't waiting for the review to end. They were getting ready to move, regardless. I bent down, yanked the stake out, and tossed it in the garage. They could mark all they wanted. Until that review was over, nothing happened here without my say. That night, my phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. "You can't win. We've already lined up the next step." I stared at it, the corner of my mouth lifting into a slow smile. If they thought I was done, they hadn't seen anything yet. The morning of the third hearing, I woke before sunrise. The oak tree stood in silhouette against a pale sky, each branch like a reminder. Deep roots outlast shallow plans. As I sipped my coffee, my phone buzzed. A voicemail from Mark. "Danny, call me as soon as you get this. It's urgent." When I rang him back, his voice was clipped. "They've escalated. Filed an emergency motion to bypass the historical review entirely, claiming it's a public hazard due to structural instability." I almost laughed. They think they can scare the board into fast-tracking demolition? That's the idea. But here's where it gets interesting. The motion triggered a mandatory inspection by the State Preservation Office. And guess who's leading it? Who? Margaret Hale. She's thorough. I remembered Margaret from years ago. She'd led a preservation project on the old courthouse. The woman could spot original joinery from 20 paces, and she didn't scare easy. 2 days later, she arrived in a wide-brimmed hat and practical boots, clipboard under her arm. We walked the property together, her hand brushing the banister, her eyes lingering on the fireplace tile, the crown molding. When she reached the oak tree, she stopped completely. "This is registered in the state's Memorial Tree Archive," she said, tapping her pen against the bark. "That changes things." A week later, the board reconvened. The developers sat stiff, their lawyers whispering in low, urgent tones. Margaret's report was concise. The property and tree meet criteria for historical protection. Any demolition or significant alteration would require a multi-year exemption process. I didn't need to look at the developers to know the blow had landed. That evening, Emily and Brian appeared together. "You've ruined everything," Brian spat. "No," I said. "I've preserved something." Emily's voice was quieter. "You think you've won, but the developers aren't the only ones who can buy a property." She slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a formal offer from them. "We'll buy it outright, market value, cash, you can walk away." I looked at the paper, then at them. "That's generous," I said, "and pointless. I'm not selling to you either." Brian's jaw clenched. "Why? Out of spite?" "No, out of principle." 2 days later, the twist began to take shape. I met with Mark at the diner, sliding him a folded piece of paper. "That's the name of the buyer I want you to approach," I said. He read it, eyebrows climbing. "Danny, they're going to outbid anyone else. But are you sure?" "Positive, and make sure the offer is contingent on one thing. I stay in the house until I die." When the sale closed a month later, Emily and Brian were blindsided. The buyer wasn't a developer. It was the local Heritage Trust, funded in part by the same veterans, group that had rallied for the oak tree. I watched from the porch as the sold sign came down, replaced with a small bronze plaque. Harper House. Protected historical property. The trust paid me more than fair market value. Enough to secure my retirement, plus a lifetime tenancy clause. They couldn't touch the house, the tree, or me. The next Sunday, I hosted a small gathering in the yard. Neighbors, friends, Antonio, even the reporter. Emily and Brian didn't come. But they drove by slowly, windows down, watching as people laughed under the oak tree shade. If you think this was just about keeping a roof over my head, you're not even close. It was about showing them, and everyone else, that some things aren't for sale. Not for money, not for convenience. And definitely not for people who don't understand their worth. The evening after the gathering, the house was quiet again. The laughter and voices still seemed to echo faintly in the walls, the way a place holds on to joy if you let it. I walked out onto the porch with a glass of iced tea. The plaque by the oak caught the last light of the setting sun, glowing warm against the dark grain of the tree. I reached out, fingertips brushing over the engraved letters. Not just my name, the story of this place. Across the street, Mr. Davies from 2 doors down was watering his garden. He raised his hand. "Looks good, Danny. Feels right." I smiled. "Yeah, it does." Inside, I took the old ledger from the shelf. The pages were worn soft at the edges, filled with notes about repairs, additions, memories. Tonight, I opened to a fresh page and wrote, "Year 1 under protection. House stands, tree stands, roots deeper than ever." Later, I sat in my recliner, looking at the mantel. The ballerinas were still there, catching the light just the way my wife used to like. For a moment, I could almost hear her humming. "Kept it safe," I murmured into the quiet, "just like I promised." The next morning, a letter came from the Heritage Trust. They'd scheduled an annual open house. People from the community could tour the place, hear its history. They wanted me to be the guide. I laughed, picturing Emily and Brian reading about it in the paper. If they came, they'd have to walk through the front door like everyone else, as guests, not owners. On the day of the first tour, I stood in the doorway, greeting strangers and neighbors alike. Some listened politely, others lingered at the oak, reading the plaque. A young boy tugged at his father's sleeve. "Can we plant one like that at home?" The father smiled. "We can try." And that, I thought, was the whole point. Not just keeping something, passing it on. As the last visitors left and the yard grew quiet again, I leaned against the doorframe. The sun dipped low, the air cooling. This house wasn't just where I lived. It was proof. Proof that standing your ground doesn't always mean raising your voice. Sometimes it means planting your feet and letting your roots do the talking. If you've stayed with me to the end, you already know. It was never about the money. It was about knowing that when the time comes, the people who think they can take everything walk away with nothing that matters. The week after the open house, I found a thick envelope in my mailbox. Sender, Whitford and Ames, LLP, my kids, new attorneys. Pages upon pages of filings, demanding the, quote, cancellation of sale, accusing me of emotional manipulation, and, of course, the classic threat. If necessary, we will refile for guardianship. I set the envelope on the kitchen counter and took a deep breath. Fear? No. Just the sense that I was turning into the final stretch of a very long road. I called Mark. "It's here," I said. "No problem," he replied calmly. "Our letter is ready." That evening, as the sun threw warm lines across the room, Mark came by, pulled 2 documents from his bag, and laid them on the table. The first page had a bold header, Lifetime Tenancy and Preservation Easement. The second read, Community Dedication, Evelyn Harper Garden. My eyes stayed fixed on the second header. Mark smiled. The trust officially designates the backyard as the Evelyn Harper Memorial Garden, open to the public, protected from any future sale or development. If they thought this was just about a house, they had no idea what was coming next. 2 days later, the certified letter from our side landed in their hands. I pictured them sitting around Avery's kitchen island, tearing open the envelope, expecting some kind of surrender. Instead, they got 3 pages of legal language they couldn't fully understand, followed by the cold reality in plain English. The sale stands. The trust holds title. Lifetime tenancy is in effect. The property's historic designation makes any redevelopment impossible. Violations will result in immediate forfeiture of claims. No loopholes. No appeals that wouldn't bleed them dry in court. They were boxed in. That night, my phone lit up with an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened later, all I heard was my son's voice, clipped, controlled, but cracking at the edges. "This isn't over, Dad." He was wrong. If you think this is where the story ends, you're nowhere close. The next morning, I brewed my coffee as usual, the quiet rhythm of the percolator almost drowning out the sound of tires crunching in the driveway. Through the blinds, I saw a black SUV. 2 men stepped out in tailored suits carrying slim briefcases. Not lawyers this time. The 2 men didn't knock right away. They stood there, scanning the property like they were taking mental measurements. Finally, one of them pressed the doorbell. I opened the door just enough to see them clearly. "Mr. Harper," the taller one began, flashing a badge from the State Historical Preservation Office. The other man pulled a thick folder from his briefcase and placed it on the small table in my entryway. Inside were photographs, sepia-toned images of my backyard from the 1920s, complete with a fountain and the old oak tree still standing today. "This property," the shorter man said, "now falls under protected status due to its historical and cultural significance. That garden out back, it's one of the last of its kind in the county." I nodded slowly. "Yes, I'm aware." They exchanged a quick glance, like they'd expected resistance, but found none. The taller man closed the folder. "We'll be in touch for periodic inspections. It's in good hands now." When they left, I stepped onto the porch and watched their SUV disappear down the street. I could almost hear the echo of my kids' frustration, the sound of every door closing on their plans. Still, I didn't rush. Revenge tastes best when it's left to simmer. That weekend, I invited a few old friends over, people who'd stood by me long before any of this mess began. We sat in the backyard under that old oak, the evening light falling just right, as if the house itself knew it had been saved. One friend leaned back in his chair and said, "Feels like you've won." I just smiled, because I knew there was still one move left, the one they'd never see coming. The weeks after the preservation notice were quiet, almost too quiet. I didn't hear from my kids, not a call, not a text, not even one of those short, emotionless emails they used to send. It was as if the air between us had gone still, the kind of stillness that means a storm is building somewhere out of sight. I went about my routines, fixing the fence where the winter winds had warped it, oiling the hinges on the back gate. The garden bloomed in stubborn defiance of time itself, the roses opening a little wider each morning. Every time I passed the old oak, I ran my fingers along its bark. It was a reminder, this place had roots deeper than theirs, and so did I. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped by with a newspaper tucked under his arm. He tapped the folded page and said, "Saw something you might find interesting." It was a real estate announcement, a sealed auction for a property not far from mine. The address jumped out at me like it had been written in bold. It was theirs. My kids' parcel, the one they'd been so sure would make them rich. I thanked him, kept my face neutral, but the second he left, I set the paper on the table and stared at it for a long time. Every move I'd made so far had been about patience. This could be the final piece. The night before the auction, I barely slept. Not from nerves, from anticipation. It felt like those last minutes before a chess player delivers checkmate, when all the pieces are finally where they belong. Morning came crisp and bright. I dressed the same way I used to for important jobs, clean shirt, polished shoes, hair combed back. To anyone watching, I was just another bidder, another man, with a number card in hand. But in my mind, I was already walking through the rooms of that property, seeing the look on their faces when they found out. The auction hall smelled faintly of coffee and floor polish, the kind of place where big decisions were made without fanfare. A dozen or so bidders milled about, chatting in low tones, their eyes darting to the front table, where the auctioneer shuffled papers. I kept to myself, sitting near the back, watching. One by one, the lots were called. Vacant land, small houses, a commercial unit that went for far more than it was worth. The auctioneer's voice had a rhythm to it, numbers climbing, pauses timed just right to squeeze another bid from the hesitant. Then came the lot number I'd been waiting for, their parcel. The auctioneer read the description in a flat tone, as if he had no idea how personal this was to me. Bidding started low, almost insultingly so. Hands went up. Numbers climbed. I stayed still, letting others fight for a moment, the way you hold back in a card game until the right hand comes along. When it started to slow, I raised my number card for the first time. The auctioneer acknowledged me with a nod, then turned to the others. A couple of bidders hesitated, then one dropped out. Another countered. I matched him without blinking. He frowned, thought about it, then shook his head and set his card down. And just like that, the room fell quiet. The auctioneer scanned for more bids, gave the final call, and brought down the gavel with a sharp crack that seemed to echo a little too long. Sold. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. This wasn't about joy. It was about closure, about taking back control piece by piece until nothing of theirs could touch me again. The paperwork was quick. Signatures, handshakes, a folder of documents slipped across the table. When I walked out into the sunlight, the weight I'd been carrying for months felt just a little lighter. But I knew the best part was still to come, because they had no idea. I didn't rush. That's the thing about real revenge. It's patient. If you tip your hand too soon, the impact is gone. And after everything they'd done, I wanted the impact to hit like a punch they'd never recover from. So I let the days pass. I went about my life quietly, tending to the little routines that had kept me grounded. Morning walks through the park. Evenings on the porch with a cup of coffee, the same view I'd enjoyed for decades. I didn't think about them, at least not in any way they'd expect. Meanwhile, their situation unraveled in the way greed always does. They'd overextended themselves buying the new house. Too many upgrades, too much debt, not enough patience. Rumors trickled back to me, the bank calling, unpaid contractors threatening to walk, tension you could feel in the air even if you weren't standing in the same room. And that's when I sent the letter. It was brief. No explanations, no gloating. Just a polite note on plain stationery informing them that I'd purchased a certain property at auction and looked forward to discussing future plans for its use. No signature beyond my name. I imagined the moment they read it. The way their faces must have fallen, the dawning realization that the ground under them had shifted again, and I was the one holding the deed this time. But the real surprise wasn't in the letter. It was what I'd done with the property before they even knew I owned it. I knew I had to make the setup look almost accidental. Too obvious, and they'd brace for it. Too subtle, and they might miss the weight of what was about to happen. So I made it look like I was doing something small. Something forgettable. I hired a local crew to restore the house's exterior, pressure wash the siding, replace the shutters, trim the hedges. But the work they were doing was only part of it. Inside, I was overseeing something much more deliberate. The living room, once their pride and joy, had been stripped bare. The ornate chandelier they bragged about, gone. The custom cabinetry in the kitchen, replaced with solid oak, old-fashioned but sturdy, the kind my father built with his own hands. Every single change took the place further away from their taste and closer to mine. I left the upstairs largely untouched, except for one room. The master bedroom. That's where I made the statement. On the far wall, I had a framed photograph installed. It was a picture of me, 25 years younger, standing in front of this very house with the sold sign in hand. The date was printed neatly at the bottom, the day I first bought it. That's where the public tour came in. See, this wasn't just going to be a home again. It was going to be a community center, one dedicated to preserving the history of our neighborhood and the families that built it. And the grand opening? That was going to be an event. I sent out invitations to local officials, neighbors, business owners, and, here's the part that made me smile, my kids. I knew they'd come. If nothing else, they'd want to see for themselves what I'd done with the place they thought they'd erased me from. The day arrived cool and clear, a rare break from the sticky summer heat. I wore my best suit, the same one I'd worn to their high school graduations. The guests mingled out front, sipping lemonade, chatting under the awning. My kids hung back near the curb, whispering, their eyes darting over the crowd. When the speeches began, I didn't start with myself. I let the mayor talk first, thanking the generous benefactor for funding the restoration. Then the head of the Historical Society spoke about the importance of preserving heritage. Only then did I take the microphone. I kept my words short. This house has been through a lot, I began. Families have built their dreams here. Others have tried to take them apart. But some things, the important things, stay rooted. And then I gestured to the front door. The crowd followed me inside, their footsteps echoing in the freshly restored hallway. I guided them toward the master bedroom, where the photograph hung in full view. The chatter faded as people took it in. A few neighbors even smiled, nodding toward me. My kids stared at the photo like it was a ghost. Their mouths moved, but no sound came out. That's when the Historical Society director stepped forward and explained. This property was purchased earlier this year by Mr. Briggs, who chose to donate it to the community. It will stand as a reminder that our history isn't for sale to the highest bidder. It's for the people who built it. The room broke into applause. But my eyes stayed locked on theirs. They understood now. Everything they'd done to push me out had only set the stage for this moment. And I hadn't just taken back the house. I'd taken back the story. The applause faded, replaced by the low hum of conversation as people moved through the rest of the house. I let them explore. Let them admire the polished floors, the restored trim, the carefully curated photographs of families long gone. It all looked like the ending, like I'd simply made a symbolic gesture, turned the page, and walked away the bigger man. That's exactly what I wanted them to think. My kids lingered near the back door, still processing what they'd seen. They didn't know the real reason I'd invited them. Not yet. While guests filed out to the front lawn for refreshments, I motioned for them to follow me. We walked through the quiet kitchen, out into the backyard where a tall privacy fence now blocked the view beyond. I slid open the new gate. On the other side, a gravel path stretched out toward another lot, a lot they used to own. Their lot. The one they'd poured what was left of their savings into after selling my house. Except it wasn't theirs anymore. I didn't say a word at first. Just watched as their eyes darted over the freshly posted sign at the entrance. Future site of Briggs Community Garden, donated by Howard Briggs. It took a few seconds for the color to drain from their faces. They knew what it meant. Without that land, their half-finished construction project was worthless. The permits, the plans, the money they'd sunk into it, all gone. Finally, I spoke. When you sold my house, you thought you were getting rid of me, but all you did was hand me the one thing you never could handle. Time. Time to watch you burn through every cent. Time to wait until you were desperate enough to sell the only asset you had left to me. They didn't reply. Couldn't. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only they could hear. This isn't about a house or land. It's about making sure you remember you don't get to erase me. Then I left them standing there, staring at the fence, as the sound of laughter and clinking glasses drifted from the front yard. To everyone else, it was a day of celebration. To them, it was the day they learned that some roots run deeper than greed can dig. And I made sure those roots had my name on them. I didn't see them again for months after that day. Not a call, not a text. Word drifted back through neighbors. The half-built shell they'd been working on sat abandoned, permits expired, creditors circling like vultures. I stayed busy. The garden went in fast, raised beds, benches, walking paths. Every weekend, I'd see families from the neighborhood, bringing kids to plant seeds, grandparents sharing tips on tomatoes. My name was on the gate. Not as an owner, but as a reminder. By summer's end, they showed up, both looking smaller somehow. Not physically, but in the way they carried themselves. Brittle, worn thin. I met them at the garden entrance. They didn't ask how I was. They didn't even pretend to care about the community space behind me. They just cut to the point. "We need help." I let the words hang there. Once, I might have filled that silence with solutions. This time, I waited. They told me about the debts, the foreclosures, the way no one would take their calls anymore. Their voices cracked, not with regret, but with the frustration of people who thought the world owed them more. "You had everything you needed," I finally said, "and you sold it for cash you couldn't keep. I didn't take anything from you. You gave it away." My son tried to speak, but I cut him off. "You want my help? Start by telling me why you deserve it. Right here, in front of the people who actually matter now." I stepped aside, and they saw the group gathering behind me. Neighbors, volunteers, the same folks they'd sneered at when I first moved in. People who'd built this garden with me. People who'd shown up without asking what they'd get in return. My kids froze. Not a single word came out. So I turned my back and walked into the garden. The gate swung shut behind me with a sound sharper than any lock. They didn't follow. Months later, I was on my porch when I saw them drive past, slower than usual, eyes fixed on the garden. It was in full bloom, flowers spilling over the fence, kids laughing near the swing set we'd just installed. I didn't wave. I didn't nod. I just sipped my coffee and let the moment stretch. Because some revenge isn't loud. It doesn't need fireworks or shouting matches. It just needs to last long enough for the people who wronged you to understand one thing. You're still here, and they can't come back. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of the story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching to the end.